How did it get so late so soon? It's night before it's afternoon. December is here before it's June. My goodness, how the time has flown. How did it get so late so soon? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that sounds a whole lot like those central bankers who have destroyed the fabric of the price-time continuum. Right, Stacy?
In physics, that's not supposed to be possible, right? But apparently they have destroyed the price-time continuum. And we're going to talk about that in this first headline. And this is from Michael Lewitt, who is the author of The Credit Strategist. And it's very interesting. We're going to look at first the headline, The Committee to Destroy the World. And the committee is this photo, Abe there on the left, Draghi and Yellen. And before we get into the time element of this price-time continuum, I want to look at where we are in terms of the price. And he says, the global financial system no longer possesses the productive capacity to generate enough income to sustain current asset values. So we've talked about that, and he looks at Chris Wayland, who recently was here in town, but before he came to London, he was in Paris speaking. Christopher Wayland said, ZIRP and QE, as practiced by the Fed and ECB, are not boosting, but instead depressing private sector economic activity. By using bank reserves to acquire government and agency securities, the FOMC has actually been retarding private economic growth, even while pushing up the prices of financial assets around the world. So ZIRP has reduced the amount of interest payments on 15 trillion in US debt from roughly 500 billion down to 50 billion, for example.
Let's say you had a factory that produced paintings, like they do in south of France. You know, all those paintings along the coast are actually produced in factories in China. Well, I found out after living there for many years.
Yes.
But let's say you have one of these factories that produces paintings, and you want the factory to produce more paintings. So to do that, you're going to take the paint away. Now, that's not going to create more paintings, is it?
No.
So here you have an economy that runs on capital. We live in a capitalist world that runs on capital. That's the way it is in a capitalist economy. But the Federal Reserve Bank and the ECB and the Bank of England, to stimulate the economy, they're borrowing money to acquire back all of the capital, leaving no capital. So the velocity of money, which demonstrates and shows how capital is flowing through the economy at what speed, is crashing. It's been crashing for 7 years straight. The velocity of money in the globe is going straight down, while the supply of more borrowed, leveraged acquisition of that capital keeps going up. The result is there's no activity. You can't have capitalism without capital. If the central banks are continuously removing capital from the system, you're not going to get any growth. And of course, if there's no growth, there's no taxes to pay down any debt. And if you don't pay down any debt, you just have a vicious cycle of continuing this process of removing capital to save capitalism. It's like, you know, the Vietnam War. You know, we're going to destroy the village to save the village mentality.
Yes, and they've destroyed the capitalism in order to try to save the capitalism, but of course they've just destroyed the capitalism. There's none left. And he talks about these, you know, the ECB and the Fed and the Bank of Japan buying up all the sovereign debt and driving rates negative. So we're going to come to a next section of this and regarding time. And he quotes Einstein. Of course, you can't talk about time without talking about Einstein. Einstein famously said, "The only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen at once." The same is true about debt. Debt was created because everything in economies can't happen at once. In order to sustain ourselves, some future wealth must be brought forward into the present. In order to do that, we create money that doesn't yet exist in the form of debt. We then hope to earn that money in the future through our economic activities and eventually repay it. Hyman Minsky taught us that capitalism is unstable because it is a financial and accumulating system with yesterdays, todays, and tomorrows. So he then talks about the fact that in order to bridge that, we created debt to modify that instability that capitalism naturally brings about. But now we've gone backward in time. So debt seeks to bridge that instability through the form of contracts that ultimately rely on the goodwill of those who sign them. In that light, we can see the real tragedy of negative interest rates. They not only have the perverse effect of reversing the flow of time, but they demonstrate that borrowers are not acting with the good faith incentives normally associated with someone who needs money. Rather than paying forward, borrowers are paying backwards because they are effectively trying to return something they don't want. Such an arrangement renders it impossible for an economy to grow.
Right, and what we use to measure time is called a clock. And when you look at the clock and you see the hour hand and the second hand moving, you tell time. You say it's 2 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, it will be 6 o'clock. This is the instrument used to determine time. Or a calendar, for example, will give you a good reference about time that may be coming sooner or later. Now, is there an equivalent in the bond market that gives you an instrument that allows you to tell where we are in this economic analogy? And the answer is yes. It's called the interest rate curve. The interest rate curve goes up as you go further out in maturity.
Yes.
So something that matures tomorrow has a very, very, very small interest rate because the risk of defaulting in the next day is very, very small, and it's only paying you an interest for 1 day. If you have a 30-year bond, you're going to be demanding more interest rate because you're holding something for 30 years, and that whatever it is you're holding, it could be a government bond, a corporate bond, you are making the bet it won't go out of business in 30 years. And to take that, you're going to want higher interest rates. So the interest rate curve is the equivalent of the clock if you want to apply this Einsteinian analogy to interest rates in the bond market. So what happens when all interest rates are at zero? Because now the 1-day interest rate, the 10-year interest rate, and the 30-year interest rate for government bonds are near zero. To put this into Einsteinian terms, you are going through the event horizon into a black hole. You know, if you go into a black hole, if Einstein flew into a black hole, he would go through this wormhole chaotic situation and turn into the string theorem of spaghetti and become the flying spaghetti monster, no doubt. And we would throw away all of our religious books and become Einsteinian spaghetti monsterites. In economics, when you have ZIRP or negative interest rates, you are effectively going backwards in time. You're trying to buy time. You know, I tweeted about this a few weeks ago, so they're ripping me off again. I said negative interest rates are an attempt by the elites to buy time because they're so freaked out about the ecosystem exploding, the bond market now about to explode, the stock market stretched and about to explode. They're willing to give money away to governments at a loss in the hopes that somehow the governments are going to wave a magic wand and stop them from dying. It's like a pharaoh in ancient Egypt being buried with all of his gold, thinking, I'm going to get to wherever I'm going loaded with gold. You know, this is what a negative interest rate is for the top 1/10 of 1/10%. They're going to give their money away to the German government or the Swiss government in the hopes that they will save them from dying a miserable financial death now that they've sponsored financial terrorism. Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Mario Draghi, Mark Carney, they're worse than ISIS, they're worse than Al-Qaeda, they're worse than any jihadi on the global planet because they have destroyed the globe itself. If Einstein were alive today, he would point to them as the equivalent of the atomic bomb that he so eloquently tried to stop countries from using.
So with this price-time continuum, the fabric of it destroyed, of course, we have this escalating levels of debt. And the article goes on to point out that by destroying the temporal and moral structure of money, negative interest rates destroy the economy. When tomorrow cannot be paid, the current regime must fail. The only question to be determined is the form that failure will assume. This may sound like philosophy, but it is cold, hard reality.
It's beyond financial repression. This is a hostile act by the government against the people. The government has declared war on anyone who's not a Goldman Sachs partner, effectively with negative interest rates. This is the shot heard round the world that set off the American Revolution, is well known. Going into negative interest rates is the financial shot that will galvanize the global insurrection against banker occupation and will put together the necessary force through cryptocurrency, gold, and silver to start taking scalps. In Athens, they're ready to take scalps.
But, you know, just like Dr. Faustus, I mean, there are certain things that should not be attempted. There's certain knowledge, and there's certain things that should not be tried. And, you know, the space-time continuum is one of them that the likes of Dr. Stephen Hawking will say, don't try to mess with that. Here, the price-time continuum is, you know, whether there's something left after this experiment, because it is an experiment that's been going on with the Bank of Japan now the ECB joining the same thing that the Fed had done before this. So it is an experiment. We have no idea who these people are and what they're doing, what sort of string they're pulling that might, like what's going to be left afterward, we don't know.
Well, in Britain, the people who are being victimized by austerity, and austerity is part of the financial repression, which includes 0% interest rates and soon to be negative interest rates in this country. The people who are being victimized by this, who are being made poor by this, they have to understand that it's not an economic policy that they need to work through, that there's some sunshine at the end of the rainbow. They have to understand that they're being pilloried and they're being pushed into essentially what camps. They're,
well, there's certainly being experimented upon. We are all in some sort of like global camp of being experimented upon, and these people don't seem to know what they're doing.
It's financial eugenics.
Yeah.
It's financial eugenics. These are the victims in the United Kingdom are having their money and their finance and their economics eugenically transmogrified by Dr. Faustus Mark Carney and his merry band of psychopaths.
Well, perhaps there will be, this is a good weekend for a rebirth. Perhaps it's a good time for it to all end and for something new to start.
Hippity hop hop, Easter's on its way. It's a mutated Easter bunny. 0% interest rate Easter eggs. You open it up and it takes all your money away. Gotta go.
Have a nice Easter.
Stay tuned for